biggest predictor of whether we feel inspired by our jobs is whether we have a friend at work. So having a friend at work, I think, is a really important way for us to maybe to talk to people when things aren't going well, to discuss things that we're concerned about, to laugh. But here's what we're discovering is that workers who see their colleagues less, are less likely to report having a good friend at work. Work is becoming more disconnected. There was this article published about 4 years ago now. Have smartphones destroyed a generation? I guess it's a really interesting question for all of us. Have these technological devices in our hands changed the fabric of human life? Our health is far more dependent than we ever imagined on our social connections, on feeling connected to other people. In fact, there was really fascinating evidence of this. The people who seem to live the longest seem to have really strong friendships. And I saw some evidence that an economist did that tried to turn this into money. You know, we spend so much of our life desiring more money, feeling like money's a sign of success. And an economist did some work on this. Thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited. I'm going to talk a little bit, really thinking about some of the challenges that any of us might have. So whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're working in a startup, whether you're working in a business that's more established, it's a really interesting time of change at the moment. And I, for a long time, worked in organizations that seemed like they were winning in that context. I was very lucky. I worked in Google for about 4 years. I worked at Twitter for about 8 years. I think it's probably important for me to say that I was not fired by Elon Musk. But I found myself working for a long time in those environments. And really interestingly, I was fascinated with the culture inside those organizations. Are those companies different to anyone here? Well, they try and tell you that they are. I found myself working in Google, and I'd previously worked in magazines, I'd previously worked in radio. I was interested in what the culture was going to be like. Was this a completely different organization? The reason why I thought that is because Google were very keen to tell people that their culture was different to anywhere else. When they first floated, when they first went to Wall Street for money, they said that in their document that they put forward, they said, our culture is completely unique. They described it like this. They said, the Google culture is 70-20-10. 70% of your job will be doing your job. 20% of your job will be doing a project you agree with your boss. 10% of your job will be anything you want, you decide. And so when I first worked at Google, I was a bit daunted by this. What could I choose to do with 20% of my time? What could I choose to do with 10% of my time? Well, the good news was it didn't prove to be a problem, because once I joined the company, no one mentioned it to me again. And I found myself asking people, are you doing something interesting in your 20% time? And they'd look confused. Eventually, I chatted to a software engineer. At a place like Google, the software developers are the real power. They run the organization. And I said to the software developer, oh, what are you doing in your 20% time? And he smiled. He said, 20% time, we call it Saturday. And what I realized was sometimes these organizations pretend that their culture is different to anywhere else. Now, what I want to talk about today is, okay, well, if sometimes these organizations mislead us, are there any things that any of us can think about? How can we make our organization more likely to succeed? Now, obviously, there's a lot of challenges in the way that we're working. There's a lot of challenges in the world of work. And obviously, this presents difficulties for all of us, not least trying to wrestle with the theme of the last 12 months, AI. And I always think, when we think about the computers taking over, and I always think of this tweet It says, let me read this for you. It says, the feeling when you realize the robots will steal your job. So look, what can any of us do? What can any of us do to understand the world? Let me show you this. When I was first at Twitter, this was a really huge moment because it was one of the first moments where Twitter and tweets really hit international news. This became just a huge photograph. I don't know if you remember this. So any time that you're on an aeroplane and they say, in the unlikely event of the aeroplane landing on water, here's what you'll do. You remember that? They say, if you get on the slide, take your shoes off. This is the only plane in history that has landed on water. And what I love about this, so when it first happened, this plane landed on water, and someone tweeted, I'll read this for you. Someone posted a tweet. He said, there's a plane in the Hudson. I'm on the ferry going to pick up the people. Crazy. And he took this photograph. Now, you might have seen something about this. This plane took off from JFK Airport and hit a flock of birds. Both of the engines failed. And so the plane was midair. It had 3 minutes to land. So they had 3 minutes before they would be at ground level. And the pilot made the decision. He couldn't get back to the airport. He couldn't get to Newark Airport, the other airport in New York. And so he decided, I'm going to land in the river. Really interesting. Now, the fascinating thing about that is no one was hurt, no one died, a remarkable accomplishment. And so the pilot involved was an interesting character. And what I was really intrigued by, in fact, there's been a film made of this, the guy, Chesney Sullenberger, the film's called Sully. But what was interesting about it was the way that the pilot described his job. He said when he was doing his job, every day he was flying a plane, he would ask himself a simple question. He said, flying a plane is much more repetitive than we might imagine. To us, it seemed exciting and glamorous. To them, they're doing the same job every day. And so the critical thing he asked himself was, what can I learn today? What can I learn that's different? And so as a result, when this remarkable thing happened, when the plane hit the birds, he'd always thought different things. He'd always thought how he could learn. Now look, that's relevant. If any of us are trying to interpret this confusing environment we're in right now, starting with the question, what can we learn today, is really vital. When we study organizations, whether they are football teams, whether they are companies, whether they, in whatever field they're in, one of the things we know is that the thing that predicts how effective the organization will run is this idea of something called psychological safety. It was pioneered by the idea was pioneered by this woman called Amy Edmondson. And psychological safety is the idea that we can speak candidly to each other without fear of consequence. So look, you might have relationships in your life where you can speak honestly to someone, and there might be others where you need to be a little bit careful. You don't necessarily say the right things. Sometimes we learn that we have to bend the truth or adapt the truth. Now, that can happen in our workplace, that can happen with clients we deal with. What Amy Edmondson found is that the more candid, the more honest, the more truthful we can be with each other, the more effective the organization. And actually, the way she discovered this was intriguing. She was working in hospitals, and she was trying to understand, could she predict which were the best hospital teams? Now, what she discovered was she had a lot of data, a lot of research that seemed to help her predict that this team would be more effective than this team. She was just completing her work, and she added one more piece of research, and that was the amount of times that the wrong medicine was given to a patient. Now, she was convinced that she'd already identified that the best teams were different to the worst teams. But what she found was, when she looked at the evidence, she found that the best teams weren't making the fewest mistakes when it came to giving the wrong medicine. The best teams were making the most mistakes. The best teams were making the most mistakes. The best teams were giving the wrong medicine to patients, sometimes as much as twice as often as the average team. And she was really struck by this. Why would the best teams be making the most mistakes? What she discovered was there was a fundamental lesson. The best teams weren't making the most mistakes. The best teams were admitting to making the most mistakes. When we realize that there's no consequence for making mistakes, it becomes a really important part of us being honest. And in fact, we witness this in a lot of businesses. You might observe big stories. You might remember, I know automotives are a big part of the local industry. And you might remember the VW, Volkswagen Dieselgate affair a few years ago. This story was really fascinating in terms of business, because what happened was the company had created cars that when they were being tested, they went into clean mode. Now, it was incredibly damaging for VW's reputation. It cost the company at one point half of its value. But there was never an order inside VW to cheat and lie. But there was an environment there where people were put under a lot of pressure. They were told they had to deliver. And so as a consequence of that, people made a decision to put the car into a dishonest mode. And that was an absence of psychological safety. It's because people felt that they couldn't necessarily do the job that was being asked of them, so they tried to work out a way to at least pass the emissions tests that the car needed to do. What we know is, from the work of Amy Edmondson, psychological safety is the bedrock of great organizations. So that might mean that inside your organization, people are willing to speak up about their concerns, or people are willing to question whether you're doing the right thing. The way Amy Edmondson describes psychological safety, she says it's bigger than that. It goes to the heart of how an organization learns. And I wanted to go and look at maybe some learnings that any of us might be thinking about right now, and how we might think about business and the way that business is evolving. So look, one of the first things we know is that place is less important than ever before. Geography is less important than ever before. This is a really important detail, because until now, unless you were in the biggest cities, you couldn't necessarily have the best businesses. Location played a really critical part in business success. Increasingly going forwards, that's not going to be the case, and it's a huge opportunity for us if we're not in the biggest cities. What we also know is that workers' perspectives of where they do work has changed. You might have seen this is international data that suggests that allowing workers to work from home to some extent is, to a large extent, the equivalent of them earning more pay. Most workers say they would earn 14%, 15% less pay if they can have some degree of flexibility where they work. Place is becoming less important. It's really interesting when we chat to people in the workforce, when we chat to organizations to try and understand how we're doing our work, and we ask them the reasons why they find working from home more appealing. And what you discover is it's a reflection that a lot of us have found the challenges of work to be overwhelming at times. The reasons why people find working from home so appealing, well, of course, number one is no commute. Number two is being more flexible. Number three is less time getting ready. What we've discovered is an average figure across Europe is, on average, workers are saving about an hour a day by not traveling to the workplace when they work from home. On time getting ready, we know that that plays a really interesting part. That's the one piece of data that does have a gender element to it. On average, women save 20 minutes a day when they don't need to get ready for going into the office, and men save as much as 5 minutes a day when they don't travel in. So what we know on average is that there's a significant time saving from working in a flexible way. Place is becoming less important. this is going to change how our cities look. One thing we know is that the usage of offices broadly, internationally, has declined. Office usage, on average now, is tracking about half of what it was before. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are the biggest days, are about half. Fridays are significantly smaller, about a fifth of what they used to be. Now, one thing we do know is that this is changing and evolving before our eyes. One of the things that we've seen recently, these are headlines about how big technology companies are asking for their workers to go back to the office. Sometimes they're asking them to go back 3 days, sometimes they're asking them to go back 4 days a week. That might be a reflection that they want workers around each other, but also presents a big opportunity, because what we know is that sometimes the best software developers don't necessarily want to give up that 1 hour a day. Organizations have always said, how can we compete with Google? But now, for the first time, this is a way that they can compete, because Google are asking people to go to a certain place more times a week. Actually, other organizations, startups, can say, we're more flexible than that. Now, let me give you another thing that any of us might be thinking about. How can any of us think about the way that we're working? Well, look, understanding how our brains work is a really critical component. And I think this is a vital consideration. Work can be so overwhelming for us. The more we think about how knowledge work takes place, the better. And I'll give you an example of this, because knowledge work, broadly, if we are going to be more effective than AI, we need to understand how we have our best ideas. All of us who do knowledge work are presented with the task of how can we do what we're doing today better than how we did it last year. And that's whether we choose to call it creativity or not. That's creativity. I'll give you some interesting evidence on this. There's fascinating lessons from neuroscience on this. A really intriguing piece of work that was done with rats. And what was done with rats was trying to understand how the different systems in a brain work. Now, of course, there's different motivations. Rats have got a very advanced seeking system. A Hungarian scientist did this work. And the seeking system is the desire to experience new things, test new things, explore. The seeking system is like our exploratory system. Humans have got it. Rats have also got a very pronounced seeking system. And the researcher who did this work, he looked into rats. He put 2 rats in a cage, and he watched them for 5 minutes. And what he found is that in 5 minutes, they did 50 examples of seeking, exploring, pulling things, biting things, climbing on things, 50 instances. Then he put a piece of cat hair in the cage. Now, these are rats who've never seen a cat, but they're programmed to respond to it. He put a piece of cat hair in the cage. They went from 50 instances of exploration and creativity to 0. Fear kills our capacity to be creative. Now, for most of us, that is not just fear of big danger, but it's anxiety. It's about feeling overwhelmed. It's about being burnt out. So when we're feeling burnt out, when we're feeling stressed, we are less creative. This quote says exactly the same, but in a different way. It says, the most concrete thing that neuroscience tells us is when the fear system of the brain is active, exploratory activity and risk-taking are turned off. When we're stressed, we're less creative. That's a really important consideration, because if our businesses are trying to expand, to develop, to win, we need to try to ensure that we manage our stress levels. Now, I mentioned I wasn't fired by Elon Musk, but he does have a role to play in shaping our thinking about work. He said this. He suggested that the amount we work is directly related to how successful we are. He said, no one has ever changed the world on 40 hours a week. And in fact, in the same interview, he said that quite often he sleeps under his desk. He has a sleeping bag in his drawer, and he sleeps under his desk. He said he works about 120 hours a week. It is worth saying, in that interview, he was crying while he was saying that. But he says he works all the time. Well, it's a really interesting idea, because we need to think about that. Is the amount we work related to our success? Well, neuroscience gives us some lessons on that as well. These probably the best example, and I'll read this for you because it's a long quotation, but this gives us some evidence of how it's suggested our brains work. It seems like our brains don't work infinitely. They're more like the batteries on our phone. Let me read this for you, because I think this really challenges that idea of what Elon Musk said. The evidence suggests our brains are configured to make a certain number of decisions per day. And once we reach that limit, we're unable to make any more, regardless of how important they are. What does that mean? So it means that our brains, maybe when we come to something at 9 p.m., our brains aren't as effective as they are at 9 a.m. Anyone recognize that? That you go home, you're sitting, you're trying to read an email, and it seems really complicated. And you read it once, you come back to it in a minute, you read it again. What is this email? So our brains don't work in the way that we sometimes pretend. Our brains are far more finite. Understanding that is a really important lesson for bosses. Can we then learn how we run our organizations? If you think about it, a lot of us have so many meetings because we've got the idea that every meeting will be as good as the previous meeting. There's no reason why we need to limit them. And the more we think about actually our brains being limited, think about the battery on your phone. When you know that you've got the battery on your phone to last all day, the way you use your phone is different to when you know you can charge your phone all day, right? If we think about our brains in that same way, we'll learn how to use them more effectively. There's a lovely example I saw of how we can think about this and how this can be relevant. There's a very famous American screenwriter, a guy called Aaron Sorkin. He wrote TV shows like The West Wing. He wrote big movies like The Social Network, A Few Good Men. And he was asked his creative process. Now, anyone who's seen an Aaron Sorkin show, they're famous because the people say funny things to each other. It's all about the dialogue in his films. His films seem alive with conversation. As he was asked, where do you get your ideas? Where do all these ideas come from? And he said, he's realized that he doesn't have ideas staring at his computer screen. In fact, he said, my best ideas come when I'm not focused on something, but when I'm thinking about other things. Anyone else have this? Anyone else have their best ideas when they're driving or walking the dog or on a train? Anyone have their best ideas? He said he has his best ideas in the shower. He said, he was asked about this. He said, my best ideas come in the shower. As a result, I have 8 showers a day. And he was asked, is this an obsessive thing? Is this a cleanliness thing? He said, not at all. It's the only place where I'm not consuming new stuff. I'm not being distracted with new things. I'm just lost with my thoughts. And when I'm lost with my daydreamy thoughts, when I'm thinking about other things, good ideas come to me. That's such an interesting lesson for all of us, that realizing our ideas might come to us not when we're consuming our phones, not when we're sitting at our computer screens, but our ideas might come to us when we disengage our brains, when we allow our brains to daydream. I think it's a really vital lesson for how we're going to win. Thinking about that has a direct implication for how we might develop work and adapt it. Next is a question about what work looks like and what does doing our jobs look like going forwards. We need to relearn how these things work. And look, it's worth saying that there's no shortage of people who worry that maybe working from home is going to produce lower productivity. There are a lot of headlines in the last year suggesting that working in a different way doesn't seem as effective. It's really interesting when we look into this because there does seem to be a difference of opinion between bosses and workers. when workers are asked, this is an international study done by Microsoft. When bosses are asked, can they do their work productively at home? 87% of workers say they are productive at home. When bosses are asked, are your workers productive at home? 12% of bosses say their workers are productive at home. It's really interesting. When we ask workers about themselves, they're confident. When we ask workers about their colleagues, they say, my colleagues can't work very well at home. We've got this strange thing that everyone except us is bad at home, but we are good. Now, it sort of begs the question, well, if everyone's worried about productivity, can we measure productivity? And to some extent we can. But it seems when we look at the evidence, it's a bit more complicated. There's a wonderful American writer, a woman called Zeynep Ton, Turkish-American. And she's written a few books. She wrote a book called The Good Job Strategy. She's now written another book which adapts it. I'll go into what her methodology is, and then I'll read you what she found. So she started looking into retail stores, into supermarkets, looking at what made these companies more profitable. And what she discovered was that the more that the organizations thought about the working conditions and the culture to work there, the more profitable they were. This was for retail stores. This wasn't pampered office jobs. This was proper work in shops. She then went on, she spent more time looking at it. And she looked at this question of productivity. When are people less productive? And here's what she found. She found that productivity was more often impacted by high resignation rates. Low productivity is down to resignation rates. She said, high employee turnover is ruinous. High turnover causes poor operational execution, poor customer service, and low productivity. So if you're worried about your team not doing well, probably one of the most damaging things for them is if their colleagues are leaving. You'll know when you're training new people up, actually that's where service levels drop, where the organization isn't as effective. So sometimes being worried about productivity, we're thinking about it in the wrong way. Thinking about how we can create a positive, beneficial environment for our workers is probably more important. And finally, what's the last lesson we can learn? Well, look, as we think about organizations and how we learn, I think there's a really important thing to emphasize, is that overall work is feeling, and society is feeling less connected. Internationally, there's a major piece of work looking at how we work. It's done by an organization called Gallup. And Gallup do a workforce survey. They look at people doing jobs and they try to understand the relationship between how we feel about our jobs and the results we achieve. And in the work that Gallup do, there's one piece of data that they often get asked questions about. The biggest predictor of whether someone is motivated in their job, whether someone feels like they are doing a good job, whether they enjoy going to work, the biggest predictor is whether someone's got a friend at work. Right? That's a strange thing, right? Has everyone here got a friend at work? Have you got a friend at work? Do you know people at your work who definitely don't have any friends at work? The biggest predictor of whether we feel inspired by our jobs is whether we have a friend at work. Really interesting thing of their recent data is that that's evolving. So having a friend at work, I think, is a really important way for us to maybe to talk to people when things aren't going well, to discuss things that we're concerned about, to laugh. Laughter is a really important part of a happy life. But here's what we're discovering is that workers who who see their colleagues less are less likely to report having a good friend at work. Work is becoming more disconnected. Now there's a challenge, because how do any of us interpret this? Workers want to be working more flexibly, but the consequence of that seems to be that when they work more flexibly, they feel less connected. I spent a lot of time over the last couple of years trying to understand a concept that I think we hear a lot, It's the idea of resilience. The idea that we can bounce back from bad news, we can bounce back from setbacks. And the interesting thing about resilience is that my perspective on it, I'm always interested in other people's views, is that sometimes we treat resilience like it's something that some of us have and some of us don't have, to the extent that we think it's a completely individual thing. Here's the interesting thing about resilience, is that principally when we see it exhibited as a collective strength. Generally, communities are resilient. Generally, teams are resilient. Generally, families are resilient rather than individuals. It's very rare that you find one individual inside an organization able to withstand things and everyone else not being able to withstand them. And I'll give you one piece of evidence that I think illustrates this. It's not directly about work, but it gives you a really interesting perspective of the way that the world's changing. There was this article published about 4 years ago now, and the woman who published it has gone on to be renowned because of this article. She wrote this article. It's called, "Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation?" I guess it's a really interesting question for all of us. Have these technological devices in our hands changed the fabric of human life? And her point, she's a writer called Jean Twenge. Very worth checking this article out. And she's convinced that since the arrival of smartphones, that the fabric of life has changed a little bit. International data, the only country that doesn't observe the same patterns is South Korea. Potentially because South Korea was marginally ahead of everyone else. But international pattern, she found these really interesting trends. The age that teenagers start dating has got older. They don't date as young. Teenagers are learning to drive much later. Teenagers are having less freedom early on. Actually, internationally, one thing that has changed is rates of teenage pregnancy have declined. Every government in the world tried to stop teenagers having babies, and the iPhone achieved it far more effectively than any government message. But here's one thing she found that I find absolutely fascinating. Right at the start of the pandemic, Jean Twenge was looking at whether teenagers were experiencing a mental health disaster. Now, look, the pandemic overall, the time it ran, I think all of us know it did have really harsh mental health consequences. But she was looking at the first 2 months. So the data arrived for her, and it was the first 2 months of the pandemic. Maybe, if you're like me, you watch Spain and Italy locking down, and we were sort of seeing these strange news stories. Things were taking place that we could never imagine. We'd never seen anything like this. And so societies were adapting and making accommodations. And what we witnessed was that we changed the way we lived our lives. Jean Twenge loaded that data in, those first 2 months of the pandemic, into her system. Now, she was expecting to see teenage depression went up and teenage resilience went down, because she only looks at teenagers. What she found was the opposite. She found in the first 2 months of the pandemic, teenage depression went down and teenage resilience went up. Wow, hang on, that's not what she expected. So she went and she looked at it again. She tried to understand what was going on. What she found was there was more to the story. The teenagers who were flourishing, who were showing really good signs, were teenagers who were having an evening meal with their families every night. The ones who were struggling were the ones who weren't. So the world had been upended. Maybe things that we weren't able to do were now being made possible. When teenagers were sitting down with their families, their strength went up. Now, I said to you before, resilience is a collective strength. Resilience is the strength we draw from each other. Resilience is the strength that we're all in it together. And that's what her data seemed to suggest. You might have seen this show, which makes the same point. It's a big show on Netflix at the moment. It just came onto Netflix about a month ago. And it's called Live to 100, The Secrets of the Blue Zones. And what's found in this show is something that's now really understood through the whole of social science, is that our health is far more dependent than we ever imagined on our social connections, on feeling connected to other people. In fact, there was really fascinating evidence of this. The people who seem to live the longest seem to have really strong friendships. And I saw some evidence that an economist did that tried to turn this into money. You know, we spend so much of our life desiring more money, feeling like money's a sign of success. And an economist did some work on this, that analysis of what social science has told us. And it's really intriguing. I'll read this for you. It says, if you volunteer at least once a week, the impact on your happiness is like tripling your salary. Right, so feeling connected, feeling part of something is like tripling your salary. If you've got a best friend you see every day, it's like increasing your salary 5-fold. Right, social connectedness plays a really critical part. I mentioned this. If we think about resilience like this, it works more effectively. Now, what's that? Why is that important for work? Because it means that any of us, if we're running organizations, understanding how we can build that team connection is the most vital part of us feeling like we're building something special. Work is fundamentally changing before our eyes, but the more we think about these adaptations, the better. I mentioned, how can any of us prepare for the robots taking over? But if we adapt and we say, okay, the secret of being a good leader right now, the secret of running an organization is back to that aeroplane landing in the Hudson. What can I learn? I don't have the answers, but what can I learn? And I'd ask you to think about these 4 things. The lessons that we had, that location's going to be less important. We can attract more talent in different places. Our brain work is different. It's not just about putting in infinite hours. Think about that screenwriter in the shower. Our brain works in a different way. Next, work itself is different. These adaptations with AI, the adaptations to what work looks like, are probably going to surprise a lot of us. The thing we often hear is that jobs that our children will be doing haven't been invented yet. And the final part, I think, is if we're going to really understand this, I think the challenge of the moment is that if we're not careful, work can end up feeling less connected. The challenge for all of us as leaders is that the organizations that will thrive and will flourish are the ones that really understand that building some sense of connection, whether we're with each other every day or whether we only interact with each other virtually, building a connection so we all feel like we're all in it together is the secret of success, both in our home lives and in our work lives. Thank you very much.
I really loved the tone of your presentation, and I researched a bit, and I looked on some of the interviews that are available, and I feel that you're like very optimistic. Fast track to 2030, according to your research. Where are we going? What's going to happen with our jobs?
Yeah, I think any of us who have played with AI knows that it presents a real disruption. The real fascinating thing for me right now is that every organization I meet, I say to them, what's your perspective on AI? And most of them say, we're too busy really. We've not done a lot on it. And so I love the organizations I meet that say, we're just going to try small uses of AI on a daily basis. So I met one retail store, one furniture store, and they said, we've told all of the people in the marketing department, the product department, we've told all of them to use AI every day. So if they're asking people to do a buyer's guide for buying curtains, then the first thing they should do is they should use AI to use it, to do it. And what I love is that probably what we're going to do is experiment much more and use it more quickly. there's a real danger that work is so busy for most of us, we never get a chance to experiment. And I think it's trying to create space, a bit like that guy in the shower. Creating space in your work for adaptation and development is probably where the opportunity comes. So, look, I can't even begin to imagine what work will look like in 7 years, because I suspect it will change more than we realize.
Questions are pouring in, and I'm really happy because Dragos did not have the time to ask you, to urge you to use our open questionnaire. So, how can we replace, in a work-from-home environment, the people interaction in the office? I'd say bring the neighbors in.
I think this is a really huge issue. I often chat to people whose organization works from home, and they say, it doesn't feel the same. People don't actually want to come and spend time with each other because I guess they don't like each other. Overall, you could end up saying that there's a risk that work becomes more transactional. That I'm earning money, I'm doing a job, and I don't care. And I think the best organizations are going to be the ones who make work feel like it's a connection of people who like each other, a connection of people who are on the same side. And that is different. It probably requires leaders to think about these things more than they've ever thought about them before. There used to be a bit of an accident of workplace culture, that we were in the same place together, and if we laughed a lot, it sort of created an environment. I always think, what's your favorite ever job? And most people, when they think about their favorite ever job, will think about laughter.
And the tribe.
Yeah, they'll think about, I really loved working with those people. And the danger of the moment we're in is that we can forget to show people that, and we can forget to think about how you would do that in a new way. So I don't think that we can't build those relationships when we don't see each other as much. But we probably need to work harder at doing it when we're together.
In the same line of thought, should we return to office? What is the long-term impact if not? And before you reply, just one switch. I just moved my chair because you told me that you cannot scan the QR code. If it's still not working, please use the link, or I have to go off stage.
What for me is interesting right now is that I think we're going to see very different approaches. Some organizations are going to say, I want people in the office every day. The evidence we've got for that is that you'll probably have to pay a little bit more to have people in the office every day because they're giving up more time. Now, you might have had them in the office for all the days before, but because the world has evolved, people will be reluctant to work every day in the office unless you pay them more. But some organizations will choose to do that. And look, we've seen organizations that are global names like OpenAI have told their workers, we want you in every day. So it's not a foolish thing that some organizations are saying that. On the other hand, some organizations have said, we think we can attract better people if we give more flexibility. We can attract better designers, better software developers. Software developers love working in their own environment, quiet, or they love creating the opportunity for them to do their work. And so it could well be that organizations that are more flexible attract the best people. I think this is the challenge of the moment right now. And the question that for all of us has to be, how are we making that decision? Because if we're just doing it based on what we liked, it's probably a mistake. If we're doing it because we're convinced we can create something that's unique, then it's worth exploring. I once worked in a place where we created a rule that every team member needed to phone their customers on the phone. Why? Because that's what used to happen, right? Business was done on the phone. And we did a customer survey, and our customers said to us, please stop phoning us. Why? Because the world's changed. Phoning people was really annoying them. Stop phoning me. It was like they wanted to do work online. Now, that was a mistake because we thought that was what used to create relationships. That's what used to work. And I think the truth is we've got to be careful not to think that what used to work in the past is going to achieve the same results in the future. So all solutions are possible, but I think you need to know why you're doing it and what you're trying to achieve.
As you said, like leads were important and connections were also important. One question here is related to productivity. Is productivity the right form to measure value for organization?
It really depends what you're looking for. I think productivity to some extent is quite a traditional idea, because if you're in a job and you're trying to improve the product you're offering to people, maybe you've got a website and you're trying to improve that, can you measure productivity in a simple way there? It's really interesting. I was chatting to someone a couple of weeks ago, and she said a better position to think about is to ask yourself the question, if you treated time of your employees as your most important asset, how would you set up work? Well, most of us never ask that question. And so we send meeting requests to each other. We spend hours in meetings where most people aren't saying anything and aren't paying attention. We don't treat time as important. And I think if you treated, rather than worrying excessively about productivity, if you thought, how can we use the time we've got to achieve the most with it, it would probably achieve very different results than us thinking, oh, we need to be more productive. Even though they're broadly trying to achieve the same things, I think you end up with a different perspective.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought to take home. One interesting question. What do you think about universities in a time in which we use books and the internet for education? How do you see the role of the universities? There are several questions related to universities. Are universities still important these days? It seems to me like the more important information we'll learn is from the internet or books.
Yeah, I think the one thing that universities are irreplaceable for is showing that work and accomplishing things can often be a long process, and you need to dedicate yourself to it, and you need to get major projects done. But in terms of the context of the content of what universities are teaching, it's overwhelming now, the information that's available to us. So, look, the discipline of learning something structured for a period of time, knowing that we need to complete projects, is a good rigor for any of us to learn. Whether that is exclusively the reserve of universities, probably it's less the case than it's ever been. So, if someone right now wanted to learn what's happening in AI, I suspect they'll learn far more by exploring YouTube than they would by going to university. And that's one of the challenges. I think, I'm still a strong advocate of structured education, because I think it sets us up to work in the world of work and understand that goals are often complex and require a period of time. But it's been more disrupted than ever before, I think.
We have so many questions, and everybody's really curious to pick your brain. And I promise to you that we have all the questions after the event, and we'll send them to you, and we'll try to write a piece of article about that. But I want to ask another one, and I think this is from someone who actually saw one of your interviews. You ran Twitter's business in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and you're basically responsible for the business development of the company in these continents. And then you wrote Fortitude, which is a smash hit, bestseller. You're an overachiever. And the question is, we kind of live in an era in which overachievers are looked upon like some sort of Marvel heroes of modern age. Yet you preach, eat, sleep, repeat. Are we living a lie?
What you often find with overachievers is there's actually something wrong with them rather than something right with them. So my dad was a big drinker. We had sort of problems at home. And so, what you often find in that situation is people Not that they've got something extra to them, but they've got something less to them. And I'm definitely an example of that. Look, I think you're right, though. What we can end up doing is we can end up celebrating the idea that we all need to be working harder. That actually it's only by hustling and being relentless that we achieve success. And I'm not sure it's the recipe for happiness overall. To make people feel like they can never rest, they can never stop working. While there are some people who achieve incredible amounts for that, I'm not sure it's overall going to make all of us happier. And look, my time at Twitter is a really interesting one because we look back now and Elon Musk has gone in there and done so many disruptive things. And
You're
changed
very
everything.
polite.
What's that?
You're very polite.
Yeah, he created chaos. But one of the things he did there is he threatened people. He said, unless you do this, I'm going to fire you. And that might seem like, oh, that's strong leadership. But you end up, when you do that, that's the absence of psychological safety. When you do that, you often create anxiety for people. You create an environment where people can't do their best work. So I think thinking more about how people can do their best work and be happy and feel motivated is probably a more sustainable way for us to think about work.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for your questions.